The Dust Bowl was a severe environmental disaster that occurred in the 1930s, primarily affecting the central United States, particularly the Great Plains. It was a period of intense dust storms, drought, and ecological collapse that dramatically altered the landscape, economy, and lives of millions of people. The Great Plains had long been a region where agriculture was difficult but feasible, relying on rainfall patterns and the resilience of its soil. However, by the early 20th century, farmers had begun to transform the region with new technologies, such as mechanized plows and deep-rooted crops. The over-farming of the land, paired with poor farming practices and the changing climate, set the stage for what would become one of the most devastating ecological disasters in American history. At the turn of the 20th century, new farming techniques allowed settlers to cultivate vast areas of land that had previously been considered unsuitable for agriculture. Mechanized equipment like tractors and plows made it easier to break the tough soil of the Great Plains. Farmers believed that the land was fertile and capable of supporting large-scale farming operations. However, this meant that farmers began to overplant crops like wheat, stripping the land of its natural grasses, which had previously held the soil in place. By the early 1930s, crop yields had significantly increased, and the demand for wheat was high due to global factors, including World War I. Farmers plowed up even more of the land, expanding their farms into areas that had once been barren or too fragile for cultivation. The situation began to change in the early 1930s when a severe drought set in across the region. The lack of rainfall caused the crops to fail, but the damage was compounded by the fact that the soil had been left vulnerable. With little to hold it in place, the wind began to carry the topsoil away. This resulted in frequent dust storms, as gusts of wind picked up the dry earth and carried it over great distances. The land had become barren, unable to produce crops, and the winds carried away the topsoil, further degrading the environment. The Dust Bowl reached its peak in the mid-1930s, with some of the worst storms occurring in 1934 and 1935. The storms were so intense that they could blot out the sun, turning day into night and covering homes, fields, and entire towns in thick layers of dust. The dust was often so thick that people were forced to stay indoors, and even then, they had to seal their windows and doors to prevent the dust from infiltrating their homes. The storms would sometimes last for days, and the air was filled with a choking dust that caused health problems for those exposed to it. The impact of the Dust Bowl was devastating. Farmers who had already struggled due to the Great Depression were now facing a crisis that ruined their crops and destroyed their livelihoods. Many were forced to abandon their farms and move west in search of work, with California being a popular destination. The movement of displaced people was so large that it became known as the Okie Migration, as many of the refugees came from Oklahoma, though people from other states such as Texas, Kansas, and Arkansas were also affected. These migrants faced difficult conditions in California, where they were often treated with suspicion and discrimination. The labor market was overcrowded, and many found work as agricultural laborers, performing grueling tasks for low pay. The Dust Bowl's environmental impact was not limited to the Great Plains. The dust storms spread across the country, reaching as far as the East Coast. The dust even made its way to Europe, where it caused concern about the global scale of the problem. The environmental damage in the Great Plains was so severe that it took decades for the region to recover. Soil erosion had stripped the land of its fertility, and it took years of conservation efforts to restore the soil and prevent future erosion. In response to the crisis, the federal government took several steps to try to address the disaster. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal programs included measures aimed at helping farmers, such as the creation of the Soil Conservation Service, which promoted better farming techniques to prevent soil erosion. The government also provided financial assistance to farmers who had been hit hardest by the drought and the dust storms. Programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, were created to employ young men in conservation work, such as planting trees and building structures to prevent soil erosion. The government also bought land from farmers to reduce the pressure on overworked soil. One of the most significant changes during the Dust Bowl era was the shift in agricultural practices. Prior to the disaster, farming had been focused on monoculture crops, such as wheat, which left the soil exposed and vulnerable to wind erosion. After the Dust Bowl, conservation efforts emphasized crop rotation, the use of cover crops, and the planting of grass to hold the soil in place. These techniques helped restore the land's fertility and prevented future dust storms. The federal government also encouraged farmers to reduce the amount of land they cultivated and to adopt more sustainable farming practices. The Dust Bowl was not only an environmental catastrophe, but also a social and economic crisis. The farmers who lost their land during this period were among the poorest and most vulnerable members of society. Many of them had already been struggling with debt, and the loss of their crops and livelihood pushed them into even greater poverty. The Great Depression had already made life difficult for millions of Americans, and the Dust Bowl compounded these problems. The impact on the health of those living in the affected areas was also severe. The dust storms caused respiratory problems, with many people suffering from dust pneumonia. Children were especially vulnerable, and many suffered from long-term health issues as a result of exposure to the dust. The constant dust also led to psychological stress, as people were forced to live in conditions of extreme isolation and uncertainty. The emotional toll of the Dust Bowl was profound, and many families were left with nothing, both physically and emotionally. Over time, the Dust Bowl gradually ended as the drought conditions in the region improved and new farming techniques took hold. The government's efforts to combat soil erosion and improve farming practices helped restore the land. And by the end of the 1930s, the worst of the disaster had passed. However, the memory of the Dust Bowl and its devastating effects on the people and the land remained long after the storms had stopped. In the years that followed, the Dust Bowl became a symbol of both the environmental fragility of the Great Plains and the resilience of the people who lived there. It highlighted the dangers of over-farming and the need for sustainable land management. It also reinforced the importance of government intervention in times of crisis and the role of science and conservation in addressing environmental challenges. The Dust Bowl also had a lasting impact on American culture and history. The migrant families who left the Great Plains to seek work in California were often portrayed in literature and film, most notably in John Steinbeck's novel The Grapes of Wrath. The story of the Joad family, who struggled to survive in the face of economic hardship and environmental disaster, became a powerful symbol of the suffering caused by the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. The legacy of the Dust Bowl is still felt today. While the region has largely recovered from the ecological damage, the lessons learned from the disaster continue to inform modern farming practices and environmental policy. The importance of sustainable land management, conservation, and the need for careful stewardship of natural resources are issues that remain relevant in the face of ongoing challenges like climate change and soil degradation. In conclusion, the Dust Bowl was one of the most devastating environmental disasters in American history. It resulted from a combination of natural and human-made factors, including drought, poor farming practices, and the overuse of the land. The impact on the Great Plains was severe, causing widespread economic hardship, the displacement of thousands of families, and long-term environmental damage. The federal government's response helped mitigate some of the damage, and over time, the land recovered. The Dust Bowl remains a stark reminder of the importance of environmental stewardship and the need for sustainable practices to protect the land for future generations.